Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar. Today we'll be talking about Pep2Dia, a natural bioactive to manage blood sugar levels with Tammy Keiser and Audrey Boulier from Ingredia. Just before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to go over. If you have any questions for our panel, please type them in the Q&A box below and hit the submit button. We will try to answer as many questions as time allows. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please refresh your browser, as this clears up the majority of issues. If this doesn't help, please type your issue into the Q&A box and someone will assist you. We have turned webcams off for the presentations to minimize the risk of technical difficulties, but we'll turn them on for the Q&A at the end. Okay, with that cleared up, it's time to hand over to Tammy for our first presentation.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone for joining us. Diabetes is a concern on the rise. 62% of Americans say diabetes concerns impact their everyday life. 86% say diabetes will concern their health in the near future. And 37 million Americans are in the glucose intolerance stage already due to several predictable risk factors such as overweight, family genetics, age, and other factors. 1 out of 13 people have high blood sugar levels. People with prediabetes are of high risk to develop type 2 diabetes. 80% of prediabetics become diabetic. It's time to take action and block the progression. What is Pep2Dia? It is the result of an extensive research collaboration between Ingredia scientists and Lens CNRS, La Rochelle University in France. In 2015, we started with a patented publication. 2016 through 2019, research collaborations. In 2019 is our first clinical study. 2020 is the validation of the mechanism of actions. And 2021, our dose effect studies. Pep2Dia is a hydrolysate from native whey coming from cow's milk. It's a unique patented bioactive with efficient dipeptide AP that regulates blood sugar levels. It's designed for intolerance to glucose.
So now let's focus on the evidence on humans. First of all, in order to understand the population we choose, let's have a look at the main risk factors to develop type 2 diabetes. The 5 main risk factors are the following one. The age. If you are above 40, you have a higher risk to develop type 2 diabetes. The diabetes family history. So if you have a parent, brother, sister with diabetes into your family, you have a higher risk to develop type 2 diabetes. Ethnic origins. Depending on which country you are from, you have a higher risk to develop type 2 diabetes. Hypertension. If you have hypertension, it is also a risk factor to develop type 2 diabetes. And the last one is the overweight condition. You have higher risk to develop type 2 diabetes. So you need to be aware if you have this type of condition that you have a risk to develop type 2 diabetes. And so you can act and prevent it with different methods. For Pep2Dia, we focus on those three main risk factors, which are the age, hypertension, and overweight people. For our clinical study, the first one we performed in 2019, we recruit 21 volunteers with glucose intolerance. In order to be sure that they had glucose intolerance, we measured 2 parameters. The first one, the glycated hemoglobin called HbA1c, which is the history of your blood sugar content during the last 3 months. And if you have a content of HbA1c between 5.7 and 6.4, it means you have glucose intolerance. If we also look at the fasting plasma glucose, and if you are above 1 grams per liter, but under 1.25, it means you have glucose intolerance as well. So we have volunteers with a pre-diabetes condition. And if we look at age, we were at a mean age of 62. And for the BMI, which is your body weight corrected by your size, we were at a mean of 28, which is overweight people. So we are right in the target in order to prevent type 2 diabetes. And concerning the blood pressure level, we didn't focus on people with hypertension, but we didn't exclude people under drugs, so with a stable blood pressure. Now, if we look at the protocol of this clinical study, it was organized in 2 phases. The first phase was a crossover, 7 days washout, double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized study, which is quite a gold standard for a protocol and a design for a clinical study. As I said, we recruited 21 volunteers with glucose intolerance, and we divided them into 2 groups, one with Pep2Dia and one with a placebo. So we divided the people into 2 groups, one with Pep2Dia, one with placebo, as I said, and we gave to them Pep2Dia 15 minutes before a breakfast rich in sugar. And we followed, after this breakfast rich in sugar, the blood sugar kinetics during 180 minutes and the insulin kinetics during 180 minutes. Because it is a crossover design, there is a washout period of 7 days. And after this washout period, we switch the group. So the people with Pep2Dia took the placebo and the people with the placebo took Pep2Dia. So this is a good way also for statistical analysis because each person is his own control. So now if we have a look at the result, you can see here the blood sugar kinetic during 180 minutes. And what we focused on was the area under the curve, but not the total area under the curve. The area under the curve correlated by the mean fasting blood sugar. So it strengthened the results. And what we observed was a reduction of the area under the curve by 21% compared to the placebo. And it was significantly different compared to the placebo. So we proved that Pep2Dia acts on the blood sugar after a meal rich in sugar by decreasing the area under the curve among people with glucose intolerance. So the first outcome is validated. Let's now have a look at the secondary outcome, the peak of blood sugar content. Pep2Dia reduces by 7% the maximum blood sugar content. This action will reduce the risk to become type 2 diabetic and will limit suffering diabetes complication. Another parameter was the insulin kinetic. The graph shows the area under the curve for the insulin after the meal, corrected by the baseline. There is no difference between Pep2Dia and the placebo. You can see a slight reduction for Pep2Dia group in dark blue color. This is important to have a product which reduces blood sugar content without increasing insulin release. This is because people with glucose intolerance release already too much insulin from the pancreas, which leads to exhaust it in the production of insulin. This action is related to our mechanisms of action, the inhibition of the alpha-glucosidase enzyme in the small intestine. So after the phase 1 of the clinical study, we performed the phase 2, which was an open trial, 6 weeks supplementation, no dietary and lifestyle habits changes, which is very important because we wanted to be sure that the effects we will see is only due to our product and not to a change into their life. It was the same 21 volunteers with glucose intolerance and overweight condition. They took Pep2Dia at 1.4 grams before the lunch during 6 weeks. And after those 6 weeks, they went to the investigation center in order to measure the glycated hemoglobin, because the glycated hemoglobin is the story of the blood glucose levels after a period of 2 to 3 months. So here is the result of the glycated hemoglobin. You have on the light blue the result before treatment, so before the 6 weeks of supplementation, and in the dark blue, the result after 6 weeks of supplementation with Pep2Dia. So what we can see is a decrease of the glycated hemoglobin. It was significantly different before and after treatment, and whole people into the clinical study go under the baseline of 5.7%, which is the baseline to define a healthy status compared to a pre-diabetic status. So by acting every day on the blood sugar level, you act on the glycated hemoglobin, which is a key parameter to diagnose diabetes and glucose intolerance. So, of course, it decreases the risk to become type 2 diabetic with a supplementation of Pep2Dia. We also went further in 2020. We performed a dose effect study. So it was the same design, a crossover, 7 days washout, double-blind, placebo-controlled, and randomized clinical studies. And this time, 3 groups were recruiting. One group with Pep2Dia at 1.4 grams, one group with 700 milligrams, and one group with the placebo. The number of volunteers was 15 volunteers with glucose intolerance and as well overweight condition. So as you can see here, it's the blood sugar kinetic, and we also measured the area under the curve corrected by the mean fasting blood sugar level. And we have a reduction on the area under the curve, and the reduction was similar between the 2 dosage, 1.4 grams and 700 milligrams. We also look at other parameters, such as the glycemia peak, and we have a reduction also with the 2 dosage with 700 milligrams and 1.4 grams of Pep2Dia. So as you can see here, there is what we can call a threshold of the efficacy for the dose. So Pep2Dia is also efficient as 700 milligrams. So how to use Pep2Dia? Pep2Dia is efficient, as I said, at 700 milligrams on people with glucose intolerance. You need to take it before meal. And one very important point, there is no adverse events and side effects reporting in the 2 clinical studies. Pep2Dia acts on the main factors leading to type 2 diabetes and helps people with glucose intolerance to improve their health. Pep2Dia focus on the first step to prevent type 2 diabetes, and with the chronic supplementation, it has an effect on the glycated hemoglobin. Now we will have a look on the ingredient comparison, and the most famous ingredient on the market for glucose intolerance are chromium and cinnamon. So if we look at the table, what we have is a similar population. All the clinical studies were performed on pre-diabetic people or people with glucose intolerance. So we can actually compare the results. And we focused on the result on the glycated hemoglobin because it is a high parameter and a key parameter in order to prevent type 2 diabetes. If you reduce the value of the glycated hemoglobin, it's meaning that you act every day on your blood sugar content, and you can reduce all your blood parameters in order to prevent type 2 diabetes. And as you can see, for chromium or cinnamon, there is no significant result for the treatment if we compare with the baseline and the final, so before and after treatment. And for Pep2Dia, the results were significant. Between the baseline and the final value, we have a reduction significantly different from the before treatment. So we have an effect of Pep2Dia every day on the glycemia, and it will improve the glycated hemoglobin. So now let's focus more on the regulation and the application for Pep2Dia. Pep2Dia is a food-grade patented ingredient. The patent, published in 2015, protects its mechanisms of action. As a whey protein hydrolysate, Pep2Dia has a clean labeling. It is not classified as novel food in Europe and self-GRAS declared in the US. And I am very happy to tell you that we received few days ago a positive letter from the US FDA for the NDI registration for Pep2Dia. So now Pep2Dia is authorized in food supplements. So now let's have a look of Pep2Dia and its application. Pep2Dia is under a powder form. It is pH stable at 3 and over 6. It is stable at temperature like a pasteurization without stabilizer. And there is a good radiation at cold and at 50 degrees. And one very important point is the bioactivity after a treatment. So we performed a preclinical study in order to see if Pep2Dia is still efficient after an UHT treatment. And we can confirm that the bioactivity is maintained after an UHT treatment. We still have efficacy on the reduction of the blood sugar level after a meal. And for the application, Pep2Dia is suitable for food supplements and instant drinks. Pep2Dia is a very flowable powder, easy to hydrate. So now we are back to Tammy to do the conclusion on Pep2Dia.
Thank you, Audrey. And to conclude, Pep2Dia, a unique bioactive for glucose intolerance. It's the only dairy bioactive for blood sugar management. It's a food-grade patented ingredient, clinically proven to reduce glycemia after a meal, and dedicated to people with glucose intolerance. And now back to you, Nick.
Portion of today's webinar. Just to remind everyone, please feel free to type any questions you have into the Q&A box below. Our speakers would love to hear from you and answer any queries you may have. The first question we have today is coming from David, and the question is, are there issues with lactose intolerance?
Thank you, David, for the question. No, there is no issue with lactose intolerance because there is a few amount of lactose inside Pep2Dia, and the dosage is very low as well, so there is no issue for lactose intolerance.
Thank you. And we now have a second question from Ava, who asks, how does the product stand up to thermal treatments?
So it will depend of the application you choose, but so the bioactivity is conserved after a treatment. We still have the reduction of the glycemia after a meal, even with an UHT treatment.
Thank you for that. We have a question now from Samantha, who asks, what is the optimum dosage recommended?
So the optimum dosage recommended is twice a day, 700 milligrams, and we recommend to take it for a long-term supplementation in order to act every day on your blood sugar content, so at least for 1 to 3 months.
Thank you. And our next question is from Virat, and they want to know, is there a probability of adverse effect or contraindication with other foods or drugs?
If you are taking drugs, it is recommended to ask your doctor if you can take Pep2Dia in the same times. And for interaction, for the moment, we are ongoing on a study to study interaction with polyphenol, but for the moment, there is no contraindication for ingredient.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. And our next question is from Louis, who asks, how long should Pep2Dia be taken?
So as I said before, we advise at least 1 month and up to 3 months, which is also what advised the health authority in order to have a claim on blood sugar management.
I'm afraid that brings us to the end of the questions that we received today and subsequently the end of today's webinar. I'd like to thank our speakers for being with us today and to remind you at home that this webinar will be available on demand for the next 3 months. Thank you all for being with us today and goodbye.
Thank you.